At 14 months old, so just over a year, she got pretty sick. So they took her into the doctor, and the doctor said she had like a cold or the flu or something. The doctor also suggested the possibility of her having kernicterus, which I'm really sorry if I'm mispronouncing, but it's a brain dysfunction. And
poor baby.
It's a brain dysfunction that would result in some kind of like mental retardation, like or slowing down of
the cognitive.
The cognitive ability. But when he said that she might have this, it validated Clark's idea that she was severely retarded. And so he thought that it was the best that they didn't have any like communication with her. When Genie was 20 months old.
Why keep her? Fucking give her like.
And I'll explain like kind of what that meant by like not talking to her and like how that impacted her. So when Genie was 20 months old, her dad's mom died, so Clark's mom, after being hit by a drunk driver. And this set him into like a whole new level of batshit crazy. He was filled with rage like all the fucking time. And he moved the family into a 2-bedroom house. He quit his job and he made his late mother's car like a shrine to her. But he didn't really get along with his mother from what I had read because she like ran a brothel and it deeply confused and upset him as a child. Not that that's a confusing or upsetting thing, but when he was a child, he was very bothered by it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know the details of like why, if he was abused or what it was. Mm-hmm. But when she died, he like got her car and like no one was allowed to touch it and it stayed in the garage and it was like this shrine and like. So Clark took this out on everyone, his grief, but particularly Genie. He set up the back bedroom as a permanent space for Genie with a crib and a potty training chair and like 2 coat hooks, like a yellow rain jacket, and then like one other thing. Like there's no toys, no rugs, no comfort items, no lamps, no lights, except the light that's normal in the room. Nothing. And there's a window in the room. As a baby, he made her sleep alone in there while the entire family slept in the living room to be as far away from her as possible. They wouldn't even sleep in the room next to her.
Oh my God.
So she was completely alone as a baby. For 13 hours a day, he would keep her tied in restraints to the potty chair, releasing.
What the fuck?
Yeah, so she was there all day. Like she didn't get strong enough to walk or anything because she didn't have any muscle development. So he would keep her tied to that for 13 hours a day, releasing her at night to tie her in a sleeping bag and put her in the crib with a metal screen cover to where he'd like shut the crib like a drawer. Like that's all she knew for years.
I would
and years
never
and years.
say this about anyone else, but I hope by the end of your story, this dude's fucking dead.
I mean, yeah.
If not, I want to murder him.
He is. So he tied up her arms and legs so she couldn't move. Occasionally, he would forget, intentionally or otherwise, I'm not sure, to take her off the potty chair. So she'd stay there for 39 hours, sometimes more. The room was kept pitch black with blackout curtains, and there was no stimuli for her in there and no human interaction.
No, I mean, so her brain's getting nothing.
Yeah, nothing. And her eyes, like, she can't see well because she's in the same size of room. And there's no light in there.
Oh my God. Mm-hmm. My heart is just broken.
Oh, it gets worse. So Genie naturally would cry and yell. Likely due to her isolation, she hadn't learned how to talk. And if she attempted to speak, cry, or even make a sound, her dad would, quote, act like a dog and just growl at her and bark at her and scratch her till she stopped making noise. The hell? What the hell? Like, is this real? He just like barked at her? It's terrible. He also physically abused Genie with force. It was never clear as to whether any of the abuse was sexual, but researchers later said that they think there probably was sexual abuse because Genie had learned to masturbate as a young child, and typically young children don't masturbate. Like they don't really, they might like touch themselves and things like because they're exploring their body, but like I'll talk a little more about it later. But it was in a way that she knew what she was doing. So it's also possible that the dad forced the son to sexually abuse her. And the researchers had said that later too. Like they think maybe there had been something like that happening. But there's no proof or evidence that did happen. Clark only fed her as if she were a baby, even as she began to get older. He'd only give her small amounts of baby food, liquids, and occasionally soft-boiled eggs. And he'd feed it to her like a baby, but he'd tie her up, so like a restrained baby. He or Genie's brother would force feed her with a spoon until she would choke. They did this purposefully, and then they'd rub the food all over her face and make fun of her because she couldn't swallow the food fast enough that they were like force feeding her.
How does this shit fucking exist in the world? Like,
I don't know, but it's terrible. So Genie's brother and mom were also now not allowed to talk in the house. Nobody was allowed to leave the house except for him and except for the son to attend school. He beat John excessively with severe threats, and severe threats that if he told anyone, he'd die or, whatever it was. I don't know what the threats were. John, as a child, was forced to abuse Genie, and he had tried to run away many times, actually. But Genie's dad would always find him or something like that, and he'd be drugged back into the house. Genie's dad also had an extremely low tolerance for noise, which made their house silent. No TV, no radio, no one's allowed to talk. It was just this weird silent house where the mom is mostly blind and can't do anything. The children are terrified. And then there's Clark, who's just crazy. The wife was threatened she'd be killed if she talked to her friends, her parents, the police, etc. So she had friends and her parents, but she started pulling away from them. For years, the dad told the family that Genie would die before she was 12 from her retardation, quote, or illnesses, quote. But if she didn't, he'd allow the wife to then get help for her. So he's you can call a counseling and all this stuff, but I'm pretty sure she'll die by the time she's 12, so she doesn't even matter. Keep her in the spare room. Genie's 12th birthday came and went, still locked to the potty chair in the room, still sleeping in the crib at night. Her birthday came in 1969 and no one did anything. Finally, when Genie was 13 and a half, her mom escaped with Genie blind. And Genie wasn't blind, but it later came to be known that her eyes were perfectly functioning, but she couldn't see past I think it was 9 or 13 feet because that was the walls of her room. And she hadn't developed any she'd
never seen
anything
farther away. Yeah.
Yeah. So she could only really see what was in front of her.
And she's been in the dark. So her eyes haven't adjusted to light.
Yes, exactly. So the mother managed to get them to Monterey Park where her parents lived. Now, Genie's brother John was 18 now, and he had run away for good, and he was staying with friends. So 3 weeks later, after she had escaped with Genie to go to the parents' house, the mom tried to apply for disability. But she accidentally went to the wrong office because her eyesight was bad. She couldn't read the door. And the office over was actually a social worker's office for children. The social worker saw Genie and assumed Genie was 6, maybe 7 years old, and likely autistic based on kind of her expressions and what she was doing and, not talking and things. The mom wasn't covering anything up. She's they're oh, she's 6 or 7. And the mom was no, she's 13 and a half. And when they said that, the social worker called the police. And Genie was immediately taken to the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. The hospital immediately called the chief psychologist and a doctor who was an expert in child abuse because they immediately were this is what this is. Her parents were immediately questioned, both Clark and Irene, heavily, which is actually where we got the majority of the information I just shared. And there was more stuff, but I just
so they said they did it.
Yeah, they're we thought she'd die by the time she was 12, so we kept her in this, and we force fed her and all this stuff. They just said what they did. Upon hearing all of this, obviously the parents were arrested for child abuse. Only a week or two after charges were given, her dad did die by a self-inflicted single gunshot wound to the head. He left 2 suicide notes that were found anyway. One said, "Be a good boy, I love you." They're assuming that's to John. And the other said, quote, "The world will never understand." And then there was a lot more than that, but I don't want to share it, and I didn't read it because I don't care. So
yeah, I don't really care
I don't
either.
care what you had to say. Bye. Genie's brother and mom began supporting her, and her mom declared that she largely didn't know what was going on because of her own abuse, her fear, and her near blindness. Genie was extremely malnourished when they got her. She was 4'6" at 59 pounds. She had a distended abdomen, which essentially I had to look that up. It means extreme bloating. In some cases of malnourishment and abuse and beating, you can get a big belly. But there's not actually fat there. She also had, which this is a genetic thing. It has nothing to do with the abuse, but she had 2 entire sets of teeth in her mouth, which I had a friend growing up who had that. She had to get them all removed because she grew 2 sets of teeth.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, it's just a strange genetic thing that can happen.
But normally you'd get care for that, where she was getting nothing.
Where she was 13 and had double, what do you have, 32 teeth or 28 teeth or something? One of those is the alphabet.
50?
Maybe that's 27. We don't know. How many teeth do you have? Let us know. How many alphabets are there? We don't know.
I have 50. I don't know how many you have. That's fucking
I have
sad.
4. Yeah, no. Bless you. So her hips were genetically deformed, like I mentioned, and she had a very unnaturally small rib cage. So a lot of these were genetic issues that didn't have much to do that we know of with the abuse. She also, like I said, couldn't focus on anything more than 10 feet, which was the size of the room. But other than that, her vision was technically medically good. This began a vast series of tests, though. She couldn't straighten her limbs and couldn't stand up
she's been
by herself.
tied down forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so her limbs were like stuck to her body like they would be if they were tied constantly. She did learn to walk, but very, very apprehensively with her arms in front of her. I don't know if that's because she can't see well or she's defensive or both. Her physical abilities and motions were functioning at the level of a baby, they said, about 12 months old. She couldn't chew and she could barely swallow and she was not potty trained. She, without control, salivated, spat, sniffled, or blew her nose on anything within reach. And she had no understanding of personal property, taking things often without asking, which she couldn't talk, which I'll get to. And this is also when doctors noticed that she had started masturbating. Doctors discovered that although she had the cognitive abilities of a 13-month-old, she was extremely interested in stimuli and seeing new objects and things and was very curious. She didn't seem very interested in people at all, actually, but she also didn't seem afraid of people. She was like okay with strangers and would like sit on people's laps and stuff. Like she wasn't unfriendly. When her mom was near her, though, her entire body would tense up, which is then they're like, okay, well, does it remind her of her abuser or was her mom a part of that? Like, was her own lying? Like, we don't know. Jeannie didn't respond to words in any way at all. But she did sometimes respond to facial expressions and like gestures that people made. She made no noise, no sound, not even crying, which makes me
brainwashed into not doing that.
She was very afraid to make a sound. She seemed to understand about 15 to 20 words, however. And at the age of 14, she could say a handful of things like stop it or no more. But they did say that it was mostly negative things she could say, like no. Doctors announced she was not autistic and she had no brain damage. Doctors argued whether or not she had been born with mental retardation, which, again, they use those words. Maybe she did have a lag in learning, but they also couldn't say that she did because maybe it was due to her, like, access to stimuli and education and, like,
your brain's
lived in
not
a dark room.
develop. Yeah.
Yeah. So her doctor, James Kent, really deserves applause here because he dedicated himself to Genie and Genie's progress, and she did actually start to progress. She started responding to puppets. She learned to dress herself. She learned to go to the bathroom sometimes without assistance. She could go on walks, and she had more appropriate emotional responses than like freaking out or shutting down or things like that. She was also obsessed with classical piano, and she would like really be very responsive or listen when that was playing. However, in December, the NIM, which is the National Institute of Mental Health, gave her doctors a grant to do studies on her, which led to public distress about exploitation. But it also seemingly provided more funding for her care. So doctors were like, sweet, now we have all this money to care for her. But then also there came this whole discussion of her being used, like, they called it like overworking her. Like they would do tests on her for like 12 hours a day to get like research stuff.
So it became more about helping her get better and like studying how she got better. So making her,
and then she would like, they'd be like, nope, keep working. We have 3 hours left to get the, whatever it was.
Poor girl.
Yeah. So she, for the first time ever, actually sought a human for comfort. So she wasn't interested in people. But in 1971, after 2 years in the hospital's care, so she was about 15 years old at this time, Genie was being fostered by Jean Butler, who was her special education teacher. And Genie continued to progress and actually started reaching out for emotional support for humans. Genie's mom visited her a lot, and she had a surgery where most of her vision was restored. And Genie and her mom actually began a relationship. Genie actually eventually moved into a second foster home with more of her researchers. So it looks like she was moving around with different researchers, which again, people are like, well, is she being overworked? Is she being woken at night? Is she being prodded? Is she being like a zoo animal? Are they just watching her all day? Like, what's happening? Genie eventually improved so much that she could go to a school for other students her age, which was insane. She had like went up to like special education students her age. She also hit puberty, which meant that her physical health had vastly improved because you can't hit puberty if you're malnourished or having physical issues. So by the time she was 18, she knew what most objects were called, which was great. She could also communicate verbally in short and fragmented responses. So I'm going to say a really sad quote from Genie, but I couldn't find many direct quotes from her. But this is a quote from her when she was a little older. Father hit Genie, big stick, cry. So she could communicate like that.
Yeah, but still like a toddler.
Yeah, but she would talk in this sort of way. She finally scored as a youth for cognitive response tests versus scoring as an infant or baby. This year at 18, Genie moved back in with her mom in her childhood home.
Oh.
The home that Clark owned. However, one of the researchers maintained legal guardianship